The woman's silhouette against the rising sun caught Frank Kendrick's attention before he'd even finished pulling on his boots. Her movements deliberate and practiced, as she worked the fence line on the eastern pasture of his ranch outside Angel's Camp, California, in 1876. Frank grabbed his rifle out of habit more than necessity, then reconsidered and left it by the door. He'd seen plenty of trouble in his 32 years, enough to know the difference between a threat and someone trying to survive. This looked like the latter. He stepped onto the porch of his ranch house, the October morning crisp enough to see his breath, and watched her work. She had good form, he'd give her that. The way she twisted the wire and set the post spoke of someone who'd done manual labor before, not some city woman playing at ranch work. He made his way down to the fence line, his boots crunching on the frost-touched grass. She didn't startle when she heard him approach, just kept working on the broken section of fencing that had been on his list of things to fix for the better part of 2 weeks. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and clothes that had seen better days. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth to protect them from the wire. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice even and non-threatening. She straightened up, meeting his eyes directly. Hers were green, he noticed, the color of new grass after spring rain. "Morning. I'm almost finished with this section." The wire was rusted through in 3 places, and the posts needed reinforcing. Should hold now through winter if you don't get any heavy storms pushing the cattle against it. Frank studied her face, looking for the desperation or fear he'd expected to find. Instead, he saw determination and something else, pride maybe. "I don't recall hiring anyone to fix my fences." "You didn't." She turned back to her work, twisting the final piece of wire into place with practiced efficiency. "But I needed somewhere to stay, and I figured earning my keep was better than begging for charity or moving along to the next town with nothing in my pockets." "How long have you been out here?" "Started about 2 hours before dawn." "Did some work in your barn too, mucking out the stalls and making sure your horses had fresh water and feed." "The bay mare in the 3rd stall has a stone bruise on her left front hoof. Needs to be wrapped and kept clean for a few days." Frank felt something shift in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. In all his years running the Kendrick Ranch, he'd never had anyone just show up and start working without being asked. Most folks who came looking for help were looking for the easy kind, a meal and a warm place to sleep without lifting a finger. "What's your name?" "Vivian Kane." She finished with the fence and gathered up the tools she'd been using, which he recognized as coming from his own barn. "I know you don't know me from Adam, and you've got no reason to trust me, but I'm a hard worker and I don't cause trouble. If you'll let me stay in your barn for a few nights, I'll keep working. If not, I understand, and I'll move along after breakfast if you're willing to spare it." The sun had fully crested the horizon now, painting the California hills in shades of gold and amber. Frank had always prided himself on being a good judge of character, and everything about Vivian Kane spoke of someone who'd fallen on hard times through no fault of her own. "When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" She hesitated, and he saw her jaw tighten. "Day before yesterday. Had some bread and cheese in Sacramento before I started walking." "Sacramento's 40 miles from here. Closer to 45 the way I came." She met his eyes again, and he saw no shame there, just honest acknowledgement of her circumstances. "I tried to find work there, but most places won't hire a woman without references or family. I heard Angel's Camp was a mining town, thought maybe the boarding houses might need help." Frank made a decision that would change both their lives, though he didn't know it yet. "Come on up to the house. I'll make breakfast and we can talk about you staying on for a while. I could use the help around here, and you clearly know what you're doing." For the first time since he'd approached her, Vivian's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate it, Mr. Kendrick. I promise you won't regret it. Call me Frank, and we'll see about that." He started walking back toward the ranch house, and she fell into step beside him, still carrying the tools. "How'd you know my name?" asked in town yesterday when I arrived. "The man at the general store said you owned the biggest cattle ranch in the area, and that you'd been running it alone since your father passed 2 years back." Sounds like Martin was gossiping again. Frank shook his head, but there was no real annoyance in his voice. Angel's camp was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. "He tell you anything else? That you were fair and honest, didn't cheat on your word, and kept to yourself mostly?" Vivian paused as they reached the porch. "He also said you'd probably run me off your land if I came out here asking for work." Frank opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "Martin doesn't know everything. Put those tools by the door. You can wash up at the basin there while I get the stove going." The interior of the ranch house was simple but well-maintained, the kind of place that spoke of a man who took care of what was his, but didn't waste time on frills. Vivian washed her hands and face, careful with the soap, while Frank moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd been doing for himself for a long time. Soon the smell of coffee, bacon, and eggs filled the air. They sat across from each other at the wooden table, and Vivian tried not to eat too fast, though she was clearly hungry. Frank watched her carefully, noting the way she savored each bite like it might be her last good meal for a while. "So what brought you to California?" he asked, cutting into his own eggs. Vivian swallowed and took a sip of coffee before answering. "My father had a farm in Missouri. He died last year, and the bank took the land because he'd mortgaged it during a bad crop year. My mother passed when I was young, and I had no siblings. I tried to make a go of it in Kansas City, but work was scarce, and the kind of work available to a woman alone wasn't the kind I was willing to do." She said it plainly, without self-pity, and Frank respected that. "So you came west." "Figured if I was going to start over, might as well do it somewhere new. I worked my way across, doing odd jobs here and there. Learned to fix fences in Kansas, worked in a stable in Colorado, spent a month cooking for a trail crew in Nevada." She met his eyes across the table. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Frank. I just need a fair chance." "What I need," Frank said carefully, "is someone who can help run this place. I've got 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and land that stretches from here to the river. I've been managing alone, but it's getting to be too much for one person. I need someone who can handle the animals, maintain the property, and isn't going to disappear when the work gets tough. I'm not afraid of tough work. And I need to know you're planning to stick around for a while. I can't afford to train someone just to have them leave in a month when something better comes along." Vivian set down her fork, her expression serious. "I've got nowhere else to go and nothing waiting for me anywhere else. If you're offering me steady work and fair treatment, I'll stay as long as you need me." Frank nodded slowly. "All right then. Here's what I'm offering. You can have the small cabin out behind the barn. It's not much, but it's got a bed, a stove, and it's weatherproof. I'll pay you $20 a month plus room and board. In exchange, you help me run this ranch. That means everything from mending fences to helping with the cattle when needed. We'll work sunrise to sunset most days, longer during calving season. Sundays you'll have to yourself, except for the essential chores that can't wait. That's more than fair." Vivian's voice was steady, but he could hear the relief underlying it. "One more thing." Frank's voice took on a harder edge. "You'll be living on my land and working closely with me every day. I need your word that you won't steal from me or cause trouble. I also need you to understand that while I'll treat you with respect, there are going to be people in town who'll talk. A single man and a single woman working a ranch together, some folks will make assumptions. Let them talk. Vivian's chin came up slightly. I've dealt with worse than gossip. You have my word, Frank. I won't steal, I won't cause trouble, and I'll do my job. What people want to think is their business. They shook hands across the table, her grip firm and calloused, and Frank felt that strange shift in his chest again. He told himself it was just relief at having help with the ranch, but somewhere deep down, he knew it was more than that. There was something about Vivian Kane that drew him in, a strength and resilience that matched the harsh beauty of the California landscape around them. After breakfast, Frank showed her to the cabin. It was small, just one room with a narrow bed, a potbelly stove, a table, and a chair, but it was clean and dry. Vivian's eyes lit up when she saw it like he'd just shown her a palace. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "I'll bring some extra blankets down from the house. Gets cold at night this time of year." Frank stood in the doorway, suddenly aware of how close they were in the small space. "There's a trunk at the foot of the bed. My mother's things are still in there. You're about the same size she was. You're welcome to anything that fits." Vivian turned to him, and he saw her eyes had gone bright with unshed tears. "Frank, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just do the work you promised." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. "I'll let you get settled. Meet me at the barn in an hour, and we'll start going over everything you need to know about the ranch." He left before she could respond, walking back to the main house with his mind racing. He'd meant what he said about needing help, but he was honest enough with himself to admit that wasn't the only reason he'd offered Vivian a job. There was something about her that called to something in him, something he'd thought died along with his father, and the dreams of one day having a family to pass the ranch along to. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Vivian proved to be every bit as capable as she'd claimed, tackling every job he gave her with determination and skill. She learned quickly, asked good questions, and didn't complain even when the work was dirty or difficult. Frank found himself looking for excuses to work alongside her, teaching her about the cattle and the land, sharing stories of his father and the early days of the ranch. They were mending fence together on a Tuesday afternoon when Vivian asked him about his family. The question caught him off guard, and he paused in his work, looking out over the rolling hills that had been Kendrick land for 20 years. "My father came out here in '56, during the gold rush," Frank said, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times before. "He didn't find much gold, but he fell in love with this land. Met my mother in Angel's Camp. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper, proper and educated, but she loved him anyway. They built this ranch from nothing, just the two of them at first. What happened to her?" Vivian's voice was gentle, understanding that she was treading on painful ground. "Fever took her when I was 15. My father never really recovered from losing her. He kept the ranch going, taught me everything he knew, but part of him died with her." Frank returned to his work, twisting wire around the post with more force than necessary. "He passed 2 years ago, and I've been running the place alone since then. Always figured I'd find someone, settle down, have kids to pass it all along to, but it never seemed to work out that way. Why not?" The question was direct, curious without being prying. Frank considered his answer carefully. "The women in town, they're good women, don't get me wrong, but they want things I can't give them. They want social calls and parties and a husband who comes home clean every night. This ranch, it's not that kind of life. It's hard work and long hours and sometimes going to bed too tired to do anything but sleep. I need someone who understands that, who loves the land the way I do." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. focusing on her own section of fence. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "I think I understand that better than you might expect. My father used to say that farming wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. The land gets into your blood, becomes part of you. When I lost the farm, it wasn't just losing a place to live. It was losing a piece of myself." Frank looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the truth of her words written in her expression. In that moment, something clicked into place, a recognition of kindred spirits. He didn't say anything, just nodded and went back to work, but he felt the shift between them, subtle as the change in wind direction but just as significant. As November arrived and the weather turned colder, Frank and Vivian worked together to prepare the ranch for winter. They spent long days moving cattle to the lower pastures, repairing the barn roof, and laying in supplies for the months ahead. The work was exhausting, but Frank found himself energized by Vivian's presence, by the easy conversation that flowed between them during the long hours. One evening, as they were finishing up the evening chores, Vivian paused in the barn doorway, looking out at the sunset painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. "I never thought I'd say this after everything that happened, but I'm grateful for how things turned out. If I hadn't lost the farm, I never would have come here." Frank walked up beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body in the cool evening air. "I'm glad you ended up here too. This place feels different with you here. Feels more like a home instead of just a ranch I'm trying to keep running." She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes seemed to hold entire worlds. "Frank, I need to tell you something. I know we agreed that I work for you, that this is just a job, but I don't think I can keep pretending that's all this is. At least not for me." His heart started beating faster, and he forced himself to stay still to let her finish. "What is it for you, Vivian?" "It's starting to feel like the place I'm supposed to be. Like maybe everything that happened, all the bad luck and hard times, they were leading me here." She took a breath, seeming to gather her courage. "And you've become more than just an employer. You've become someone I look forward to seeing every morning, someone whose company I enjoy even when we're doing the hardest, dirtiest work. I just thought you should know, even if it doesn't change anything." Frank reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and brushed a strand of hair that had come loose from her braid back from her face. His hand lingered there, cupping her cheek, and he felt her lean into the touch. "It changes everything," he said quietly. "Because I've been feeling the same way and trying to convince myself it was just gratitude for the help or loneliness talking. But it's not. When I'm with you, I feel like I can breathe easier, like the weight of running this place alone isn't so heavy anymore. You make me want things I'd given up on." "What kind of things?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "A future that's more than just surviving from one season to the next, someone to share this life with, to build something lasting with." He paused, knowing that what he said next would set them on a path that couldn't be reversed. "I know it hasn't been long, and maybe this is moving too fast, but I need you to know that I care about you, Vivian, as more than just someone who works for me." She reached up and covered his hand with hers, holding it against her cheek. "I care about you too, and I don't think it's moving too fast when it feels this right." Frank leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, but she met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "So what happens now?" Vivian asked, her hand still holding his. "Now we take it one day at a time. Keep working the ranch, keep getting to know each other and see where this goes." Frank felt lighter than he had in years, like something that had been locked tight in his chest had finally opened. "But I want to do this right, Vivian. I want to court you properly, not just because it's what's expected, but because you deserve that. I'd like that." She squeezed his hand. "Though I have to say, I've never been courted by someone I've mucked out stalls with." Frank laughed, a genuine sound of joy that echoed in the barn. "Well, we'll just have to make sure we both clean up nice for the courting parts." The next few months were some of the happiest of Frank's life. They continued working the ranch together during the day, but now their evenings were spent in each other's company, talking by the fire in the main house or taking walks around the property when the weather permitted. Frank courted Vivian the way his father had courted his mother, with respect and genuine affection, bringing her small gifts from town and planning special meals on Sunday evenings. The people of Angel's Camp noticed, of course. Some of them approved, seeing that Frank had finally found someone who suited him. Others gossiped, making assumptions about propriety and what might or might not be going on at the Kendrick ranch. Frank and Vivian ignored them for the most part, though Frank made a point of introducing Vivian as his intended whenever they went to town together, making his intentions clear. It was during a trip to Angel's Camp in late December that things came to a head. Frank and Vivian were loading supplies onto the wagon when a woman approached them, her face pinched with disapproval. Frank recognized her as Margaret Hartwell, the wife of one of the town's wealthier merchants. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I couldn't help but notice you've been spending quite a bit of time with this young woman. I do hope you're being mindful of appearances." Frank felt Vivian stiffen beside him, but he kept his voice level. "Mrs. Hartwell, allow me to introduce you to Vivian Kane, my intended bride. We'll be getting married in the spring." It was the first time he'd said it out loud, though he and Vivian had discussed marriage in general terms. Vivian's head whipped around to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like joy. "Mrs." Hartwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water before she managed to sputter out some form of congratulations and hurry away. Once they were alone, Vivian grabbed Frank's arm. "Did you just propose to me in front of Margaret Hartwell?" "I suppose I did." Frank felt his face heat up, suddenly uncertain. "That is, if you'll have me. I know I should have done it properly, with a ring and everything, but when she stood there making assumptions about you, about us, I just couldn't stand it anymore. I wanted everyone to know that you're going to be my wife." "Yes." Vivian's answer was immediate and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Frank Kendrick, though you're right that you owe me a proper proposal later." Frank pulled her into his arms, right there on the main street of Angel's Camp, and kissed her soundly. Let the whole town talk. He'd found something precious, someone who understood him and the life he led, who loved the land as much as he did, and he wasn't going to let propriety or gossip get in the way of that. That evening, after they'd returned to the ranch and unloaded the supplies, Frank asked Vivian to come to the main house. He'd built up the fire until the room was warm and inviting, and he'd set out 2 glasses and a bottle of wine his father had been saving for a special occasion. "I know I already asked you to marry me today in possibly the worst way imaginable," Frank started, taking both her hands in his. "But I want to do this right. Vivian Kane, you came into my life when I'd almost given up on finding someone who understood this life, someone who could love this land and this work the way I do. You've made me happier these past few months than I've been in years. You've made this ranch feel like a home again. Will you marry me and build a life here with me?" Vivian's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I will. I love you, Frank. I think I started falling in love with you that first morning when you offered me breakfast instead of running me off your land. You saw me when I was at my lowest and treated me with dignity and respect. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Yes, I'll marry you." Frank kissed her then, pouring all his love and hope for their future into it. When they finally pulled apart, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. I know it's not fancy, but if you'll wear it, I promise to get you a proper wedding ring when we go into Sacramento." Vivian held out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "It's beautiful, and I don't need anything fancier. This ring means something. It has history and love attached to it." They spent the rest of the evening making plans for their future. They decided to marry in the spring, giving them time to finish the winter work and prepare. Vivian wanted a simple ceremony in Angel's camp, with just a few close friends as witnesses. Frank agreed, wanting nothing more than to make her his wife as soon as possible. Winter settled over the ranch with a quiet intensity. The work continued, harder in some ways because of the cold and snow, but Frank and Vivian tackled it together. They developed a rhythm, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, finding ways to work together that made them more efficient than either would have been alone. On Christmas Eve, they sat together in front of the fire in the main house, Vivian curled against Frank's side. He'd given her a new saddle, custom-made in Sacramento, with her initials tooled into the leather. She'd made him a quilt, piecing it together during the long winter evenings, each square representing a moment from their time together. "Next Christmas, we'll be married," Vivian said softly, running her fingers over the pattern of the quilt spread across their laps. "It doesn't seem real sometimes. 6 months ago, I was walking into Angel's camp with nothing but the clothes on my back and a desperate hope that I'd find some kind of work. Now I'm sitting here with you, planning our wedding, feeling more at home than I have since my father died." Frank pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I know what you mean. I'd gotten used to being alone, told myself I didn't need anyone. But having you here loving you, it's shown me what I was missing. This ranch isn't just a place I work anymore. It's our home, the foundation we're going to build our life on." As the fire burned low and the snow fell softly outside, they made promises to each other, the kind that didn't need formal vows or witnesses. They promised to stand together through whatever challenges came their way, to love each other through the hard times and the good, to build something lasting on this land they both loved. January brought bitter cold and heavy snows that tested both the ranch and their relationship. One of the cattle got trapped in a ravine during a blizzard, and Frank and Vivian spent hours in freezing conditions working to free the frightened animal. They came back to the house nearly frozen, their hands numb and their faces raw from the wind. Vivian insisted Frank get into a hot bath first while she made coffee and heated up stew. When it was her turn to warm up, Frank had the fire built high and blankets warming by the hearth. These small acts of care and consideration deepened their bond, showing them what marriage between them would truly be like. February brought a thaw and with it, preparations for spring. They began working on the cabin behind the barn, expanding it to make it suitable for hired hands once they could afford to bring on more help. The plan was for Frank and Vivian to live in the main house after the wedding, turning it truly into a family home. It was during this work that Vivian brought up something that had been on her mind. "Frank, I've been thinking about the ranch and our future. Have you ever considered expanding the operation, maybe adding sheep or increasing the cattle herd?" Frank paused in his hammering, considering her question. "I've thought about it. The land could support more, but it would mean more work and probably needing to hire help. What if we started slow? Added another 50 head of cattle this year and maybe some sheep next year. We could hire seasonal help during the busy times, and if the expansion works out, we could bring on permanent hands." Vivian's eyes were bright with enthusiasm. "I've been going over the accounts, and I think we could manage it financially." It would be tight the first year, but if we're careful, we could make it work. Frank felt a surge of love and admiration for this woman who was not just willing to share his life, but actively wanted to help build their future. When did you start going over the accounts? You left them on the kitchen table last week. I hope you don't mind that I looked. She seemed uncertain for the first time. I didn't want to overstep, but I used to help my father with the farm accounts, and I thought maybe I could help. Vivian, this ranch is going to be yours as much as mine once we're married. You're not overstepping. I'm grateful for your help and your ideas. He pulled her close, kissing her soundly. Let's do it. Let's expand the operation and build something even bigger together. They spent the rest of February planning their expansion and finalizing wedding details. Vivian wrote to an old friend from Missouri, inviting her to come out for the wedding if she could make the journey. Frank arranged for the preacher in Angel's Camp to perform the ceremony on the first Saturday in April. March arrived with the kind of weather that made the California landscape burst into life. Wildflowers covered the hills in blankets of gold and purple, and the cattle grew sleek and healthy on the new grass. Frank and Vivian worked from dawn to dusk, preparing for both the wedding and the arrival of the new cattle they'd purchased. One evening, as they were walking back from checking on a pregnant cow, Vivian stopped suddenly, her hand going to Frank's arm. "Look," she breathed, pointing to the western sky. The sunset was spectacular, painting the clouds in shades of pink, orange, and gold so vivid they hardly seemed real. Frank wrapped his arm around Vivian's waist, pulling her close as they watched the display. "I want to remember this moment," Vivian said softly. "Right here, right now, with you beside me and our whole future ahead of us. I want to remember how it feels to be this happy and this hopeful." "We'll make plenty more moments like this," Frank promised. "This is just the beginning for us." The week before the wedding was a whirlwind of activity. Vivian's friend Sarah arrived from Missouri, a cheerful woman in her late 20s who immediately took charge of the wedding preparations. She dragged Vivian into town to purchase fabric for a wedding dress and bullied Frank into getting his one good suit cleaned and pressed. "You're marrying the best woman I know," Sarah told Frank bluntly when she caught him alone. "She's been through hell and back, lost everything she had, and she's still one of the kindest, hardest-working people I've ever met. If you hurt her, I'll find a way to make you regret it." Frank appreciated her protectiveness. "I love her, Sarah. I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more certain of anything. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure she's happy and cared for." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. That's what I needed to hear." The night before the wedding, Frank followed tradition and stayed away from the ranch, bunking with Martin from the general store and his family. He barely slept, too excited about the next day and what it would mean for his future. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Frank dressed carefully in his suit, his hands surprisingly steady as he tied his tie. Martin clapped him on the shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day," the older man said with a grin. "Frank Kendrick finally settling down. Your father would be proud." The ceremony was held in the small church in Angel's Camp, with about 20 people in attendance. Frank stood at the front, his heart pounding as he waited for Vivian to appear. When she finally walked down the aisle, he forgot how to breathe. Sarah had worked wonders with the fabric they'd purchased. Vivian's dress was simple but elegant, cream-colored with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was styled in soft curls, with wildflowers woven through it. But it was her face that captured Frank's attention, the joy and love shining in her eyes as she walked toward him. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Frank heard himself making vows, promising to love and cherish Vivian for the rest of his days, and he meant every word with his whole heart. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife and told Frank he could kiss his bride, Frank did so with enthusiasm, earning laughs and applause from their small gathering of witnesses. The reception was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Patterson providing a simple but delicious meal. Frank and Vivian accepted congratulations and well wishes, but both of them were eager to return to the ranch, to begin their life together as husband and wife. As the sun began to set, they finally made their excuses and headed home. Sarah and a few of the other women had decorated the ranch house with wildflowers and ribbons, and someone had left a basket of food and a bottle of champagne on the kitchen table. Frank carried Vivian over the threshold, both of them laughing as he nearly knocked her head on the doorframe. He set her down gently in the middle of the main room, then pulled her close, swaying slightly as if they were dancing to music only they could hear. "Hello, Mrs. Kendrick," he said softly, loving the way her new name sounded. "Hello, Mr. Kendrick." Vivian smiled up at him, her hands resting on his chest. How does it feel to be a married man? Like coming home after a long journey, like everything finally makes sense. He kissed her gently. How does it feel to be a married woman? Like the luckiest person alive. She reached up and loosened his tie. Like I've finally found where I belong. They spent their wedding night learning each other in new ways, expressing their love with touches and whispers and promises of forever. Frank had been with women before, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of being with someone he loved this deeply. Someone who was now bound to him in every way that mattered. In the morning, they woke tangled together in Frank's bed, now their bed, sunlight streaming through the windows. Frank propped himself up on one elbow, studying Vivian's face in the golden light. "I love you," he said simply. "I know I said it yesterday during the ceremony, but I want to make sure you hear it every day for the rest of our lives." Vivian turned to face him, her smile soft and content. "I love you too, and I plan to show you that every day, through my words and my actions." They spent their first week as a married couple settling into their new routine. The work of the ranch continued, but now they were partners in every sense of the word. Vivian took over managing the accounts completely, freeing Frank up to focus on the physical work of running the ranch. They made decisions together, planning not just for the next season but for the next decade. The new cattle arrived in late April, and Frank and Vivian spent long days integrating them into the existing herd. It was exhausting work, but they fell into bed each night satisfied with their progress and secure in their love for each other. In May, they hired their first seasonal worker, a young man named Tom who proved to be a hard worker and quick learner. Having the extra help allowed Frank and Vivian to start some of the larger projects they'd been planning, including building a new barn and expanding the grazing area. One evening in June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Vivian made an announcement that would change everything. "Frank, I think I might be pregnant." Frank felt his heart stop, then start again at double speed. "You think? Are you sure?" "I'm late, and I've been feeling sick in the mornings. I won't know for certain for a few more weeks, but all the signs are there." She turned to him, her expression a mixture of joy and nervousness. "How do you feel about that?" Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I feel like the luckiest man alive. I feel like our family is growing, like we're building something that's going to last for generations. I feel terrified and excited and more in love with you than I thought possible." Vivian laughed, the sound watery with happy tears. "That's good because I feel exactly the same way." As June turned to July, it became clear that Vivian was indeed pregnant. They told Sarah first, who squealed with delight and immediately started planning, talking about baby clothes and cribs. Frank found himself walking around with a permanent grin, unable to stop thinking about becoming a father. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Vivian struggled with morning sickness during the early months. Frank took over more of the heavy physical work, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of pulling her weight. They compromised, with Vivian handling the accounts and lighter chores while Frank and Tom managed the more strenuous work. In August, they made a trip to Sacramento to see a doctor and purchase supplies for the baby. The doctor confirmed that Vivian was healthy and the pregnancy was progressing normally. They spent their profits from selling cattle on practical items like diapers and blankets, but Frank insisted on buying one extravagant item, a beautiful wooden cradle with intricate carvings. "Our child is going to sleep in something beautiful," he said, when Vivian protested the expense. "Something that shows how much they are already loved." Fall arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the hard work of preparing for winter. Vivian's pregnancy was starting to show now, a gentle swell that Frank couldn't help but touch whenever they were alone. He would rest his hand on her stomach, marveling at the life growing inside her, the child they'd created together. "Boy or girl?" Vivian asked one night as they lay in bed. "Which are you hoping for?" "Healthy," Frank said immediately. "That's all I care about." "Boy or girl doesn't matter as long as you're both all right." "But if you had to choose," Frank considered the question. "I suppose a boy would be traditional, someone to carry on the family name and eventually take over the ranch. But a girl would be wonderful too. A daughter with your strength and determination." He kissed her softly. "Truly, Vivian, I don't care. I'll love whatever child we're blessed with." As winter approached and Vivian's due date grew closer, Frank found himself growing more protective and anxious. He insisted on accompanying her everywhere, worried about her slipping on ice or overexerting herself. Vivian tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding that it came from a place of love. On a cold January night in 1878, Vivian went into labor. Frank sent Tom racing into town to fetch the midwife while he stayed with Vivian, holding her hand and trying to appear calm even though he was terrified. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Frank refused to leave Vivian's side, whispering encouragement and love, wiping her forehead with cool cloths. Finally, as the sun was setting on what had been the longest day of Frank's life, he heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the cry of his newborn child. The midwife cleaned the baby quickly, then placed the infant in Vivian's arms. "You have a son," she announced with a tired smile. Frank looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby in Vivian's arms and felt his whole world shift. The child was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air as he cried. Vivian was exhausted but radiant, tears streaming down her face as she looked at their son. "He's beautiful," Frank whispered, his own voice choked with emotion. "You're both so beautiful." They named him James, after Frank's father, with Thomas as a middle name after Frank's grandfather. Little James Kendrick was healthy and strong, with a good appetite and lungs that could wake the entire ranch when he decided he was hungry or needed changing. The first few months were exhausting in ways Frank had never imagined. Between caring for a newborn and keeping the ranch running, he and Vivian were operating on minimal sleep and maximum coffee. But Frank had never been happier. Watching Vivian with their son, seeing her rock him to sleep or sing to him softly, made Frank fall in love with her all over again. Sarah came out to stay for a few weeks after James was born, helping with the baby and the household chores so Vivian could recover. She taught Frank how to change diapers and burp the baby, laughing at his awkward attempts but praising his dedication. "You're a good father, Frank," she told him one evening as they sat together while Vivian and James napped. "That boy is lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Frank replied, watching his sleeping family with soft eyes. "I get to watch him grow up, teach him about the ranch, pass along everything my father taught me. I get to build a legacy for him." As James grew, so did the ranch. The expansion they'd started before Vivian got pregnant had been successful, and by the time James was 6 months old, they were able to hire 2 permanent ranch hands. This freed up more of Frank and Vivian's time to focus on their family while still maintaining the property. James took his first steps on a sunny April afternoon, right there in the main yard of the ranch. Frank scooped him up and swung him around, both of them laughing while Vivian clapped and cheered. These moments, simple and perfect, were what Frank had always dreamed of but never thought he'd have. When James was a year old, Vivian discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because they knew what to expect or maybe because Vivian's body had done this before. Either way, she remained active throughout, though Frank still worried and fussed over her. Their second child, a daughter they named Catherine Rose, was born in March of 1879 during a rainstorm that lasted 3 days. She was tiny compared to her brother, with wisps of red gold hair that Frank swore came from his mother's side of the family. From the moment she opened her eyes, bright blue like her mother's had been as a baby, Frank was completely smitten. "I was wrong," he told Vivian as they watched Catherine sleep in her cradle. "I thought I couldn't love anything as much as I love you and James, but this little girl has stolen my heart completely." Vivian laughed softly. "Just wait until she's older and realizes she has you wrapped around her little finger. We're going to have our hands full keeping her from getting spoiled." Life settled into a busy but contented rhythm. Frank and Vivian raised their children while building the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the region. They hired more help as they could afford it, eventually employing 5 permanent hands and seasonal workers during the busiest times. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father, learning everything he could about cattle and horses. Catherine was her mother's daughter, strong-willed and independent, just as likely to be found helping mend fences as playing with her dolls. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Frank took Vivian into town for a rare evening alone. They had dinner at the boarding house, the same place where they'd had their wedding reception, and afterward they walked through Angel's Camp hand in hand. "You remember the first time we came to town together?" Frank asked, pulling Vivian close as they stood under the stars. "When Margaret Hartwell made her snide comments and I blurted out that we were getting married, how could I forget? It was the worst proposal in history." Vivian grinned up at him. "But also the best because it led to the best decision I ever made. Marrying me, loving you. Choosing to build this life with you." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if I hadn't shown up at your ranch that morning?" Frank tightened his arms around her. "I try not to because it's too terrible to imagine. You and the children, you're everything to me. This ranch, it's successful because we built it together. Our family exists because you had the courage to take a chance on a life that wasn't easy. And you had the wisdom to see past the desperate woman fixing your fence to the person I could be, the partner I wanted to be." Vivian kissed him softly. "I love you, Frank Kendrick, more now than I did on our wedding day and more tomorrow than I do today." As the years passed, their love continued to deepen and grow. They added a 3rd child in 1881, another son they named Robert after Vivian's father. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming known throughout California for the quality of their cattle and horses. James grew into a young man who loved the land as much as his father did, taking on more responsibility with each passing year. Catherine proved to have her mother's head for numbers and helped manage the accounts when she was old enough. Robert was the adventurous one, always exploring and getting into harmless mischief. Frank and Vivian watched their children grow with pride and joy, never taking for granted the life they'd built together. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed and the ranch work was done, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the California hills in shades of gold. "You ever miss Missouri?" Frank asked one such evening when Vivian seemed particularly thoughtful. "Your father's farm, the life you had before." Vivian considered the question carefully. "I miss my father sometimes, wish he could have met you and the children, but miss that life? No. Everything that happened, as hard as it was at the time, led me here. To you, to our family, to this ranch. This is where I belong." In 1885, when James turned 7, Frank began teaching him to ride properly, not just sitting in front of him on a horse but handling the reins himself. Vivian watched from the fence, her hand resting on the head of their youngest, Robert, who was eager for his turn. "Carefully now," Frank instructed, walking alongside the horse as James guided it around the corral. "Good, you're doing great. Remember what I told you about keeping your heels down." Watching his son's face light up with pride and accomplishment, Frank was reminded of his own father teaching him the same lessons in this same corral. The legacy continued, passed from generation to generation, and Frank felt the weight of that responsibility and the joy of it in equal measure. As the 1880s progressed, the Kendrick Ranch became a fixture in Angel's Camp, known for honest dealing and quality stock. Frank and Vivian were respected members of the community. Their marriage held up as an example of what could happen when two people truly partnered with each other. Catherine showed an early interest in medicine, often helping tend to sick animals and asking endless questions about how to help them heal. Vivian encouraged this interest, remembering her own struggle to find meaningful work and wanting better opportunities for her daughter. Robert proved to have his father's way with horses, able to calm even the most skittish animals with patience and gentle handling. By the time he was 6, he was helping in the stables, mucking out stalls and learning to groom the horses properly. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1886, Frank surprised Vivian with a trip to San Francisco. They left the children with Sarah, who had moved to Angel's Camp a few years earlier with her own husband and family, and spent a week exploring the city together. It was the first time they'd been alone together for more than a few hours since James was born, and it felt like a second honeymoon. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate at fancy restaurants, and walked along the waterfront hand in hand like young lovers. "Thank you for this," Vivian said one evening as they watched the sun set over the bay, "for remembering that we're not just parents and ranchers, but husband and wife who need time together." "I never want us to lose sight of that," Frank replied, pulling her close. "The children are important, the ranch is important, but you're the foundation everything else is built on. Without you, none of it means anything." They returned home refreshed and reconnected, ready to tackle the challenges of ranch life and parenthood with renewed energy. The children had missed them terribly, and Frank and Vivian spent the next week showering them with attention and affection. As James approached his teenage years, he began taking on more adult responsibilities on the ranch. Frank taught him about breeding stock, managing finances, and the importance of treating employees fairly. He wanted his son to understand that the ranch was more than just land and cattle. It was a legacy built on hard work and integrity. Catherine, at 11, announced that she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up. It was an ambitious goal for a girl in the 1880s, but Vivian and Frank supported her dream, ordering medical books from San Francisco and encouraging her studies. Robert, still young at 7, was content to follow his older siblings around, learning from their examples and developing his own interests along the way. In 1889, the ranch faced its biggest challenge yet. A drought hit California hard, and water became scarce. Frank and Vivian worked tirelessly to keep the cattle watered, drilling new wells and rationing their resources carefully. It was a difficult time, testing their resolve and their resources, but they got through it together, emerging stronger and more resilient. Throughout it all, their love for each other remained constant, a bedrock they could depend on when everything else seemed uncertain. Frank would often find Vivian in the evening, exhausted from the day's work, and pull her into his arms, reminding her that they were in this together. "We've survived worse," he'd tell her, thinking back to those early days when they barely knew each other but took a chance anyway. "We'll survive this too." And they did. The drought eventually broke, the rains returned, and the ranch recovered. The experience taught their children valuable lessons about perseverance and working together as a family. As the 1880s turned into the 1890s, Frank looked around at everything they'd built with a sense of deep satisfaction. The ranch had grown from a struggling operation run by one man into a thriving family business. His children were healthy and happy, growing into capable young people with their own dreams and ambitions. And Vivian, his wife and partner, was still the woman who made his heart race when she smiled at him across the dinner table. On a warm summer evening in 1891, the whole family gathered on the porch after dinner. James, now 13, was talking about a new breeding program he wanted to try with the cattle. Catherine was telling them about an article she'd read in a medical journal. Robert was half asleep against his mother's side, worn out from a day spent helping in the stables. Frank looked at Vivian and saw his own contentment reflected in her eyes. They'd built this together, this life, this family, this legacy. And it was better than anything he could have imagined that dawn morning when he'd first seen her fixing his fence. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Frank and Vivian stood together looking out at the ranch bathed in moonlight. The land stretched out before them, familiar and beloved, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. "You remember what you said to me that first morning?" Frank asked, his arm around Vivian's waist. "About earning your keep," Vivian smiled, leaning into him. "I remember. I was so desperate to prove I could be useful that I deserved a chance. You earned so much more than your keep, Vivian. You earned a place in my heart, a partnership in this ranch, a family of your own." Frank turned her to face him. "You took a broken-down fence and a lonely rancher and turned them into something beautiful." "We did it together," Vivian corrected gently. "You gave me a chance when I had nothing. You saw potential in me when I could barely see it in myself. And together, we built something neither of us could have created alone." Frank kissed her under the stars, a kiss that held 14 years of love and partnership, of challenges overcome and joys shared. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. James took over more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch as Frank began to slow down, though he remained active and involved. Catherine left for medical school in San Francisco in 1896, one of only a handful of women in her class. Robert showed talent as a horse breeder, developing a reputation for producing quality stock. Frank and Vivian became grandparents for the first time in 1899, when James married a local girl named Emma, and they had a daughter. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, Frank felt the circle of life complete itself. This child would grow up on the same land he'd worked all his life, would learn the same lessons his father had taught him. As the new century dawned, Frank and Vivian found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. The ranch ran smoothly under James's management. Catherine was thriving in her medical practice in Sacramento, and Robert had just gotten married and was expecting his first child. On a spring morning in 1901, Frank woke to find Vivian already up, standing by the window watching the sunrise. He joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About that morning 25 years ago when I showed up here with nothing and you gave me everything." She turned in his arms to face him. "About how grateful I am for every day we've had together, every challenge we've overcome, every joy we've shared." Frank cupped her face in his hands, seeing the years reflected there but also seeing the same strength and determination that had first drawn him to her. Her hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around her eyes, but to him, she was as beautiful as the day they married. "I'm the grateful one," he said. "You came into my life and made it mean something. You gave me a family, helped me build a legacy, and loved me through everything." They stood there together as the sun rose over the California hills, painting everything in gold and amber light. The ranch spread out before them, alive with the sounds of morning. In the distance, they could see James heading out to check the cattle, their grandson, now 3 years old, trailing along behind him. "This is what I always wanted," Frank said quietly. "A life built on love and hard work, a family to pass it all along to, someone to share it all with. You gave me that, Vivian. We gave it to each other." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And we'll keep giving it to each other for whatever years we have left." As they watched their grandson trying to imitate his father's walk, both of them laughed, the sound carrying on the morning breeze. This was their legacy, not just the land or the cattle or the buildings, but the love that had started with a woman fixing a fence at dawn, and a man who was wise enough to give her a chance. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the earth and driving away the last of the night's chill. Frank and Vivian stood together, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something that would last for generations. Their love story had started with desperation and hope, but it had grown into something solid and enduring, a foundation that their children and grandchildren would build upon. Years later, when their great-grandchildren would ask about how the Kendrick Ranch began, they would be told the story of Vivian Kane, who walked into Angel's Camp with nothing but determination and skill. They'd hear about Frank Kendrick, who saw past circumstance to character and offered her a chance. They'd learn about love that grew from respect and partnership, about a family built on hard work and dedication. But standing there in the golden California morning, Frank and Vivian didn't think about the future stories or the legacy they were leaving. They simply stood together, grateful for each new day and the love that had sustained them through all the challenges and triumphs of their life together. The fence that Vivian had fixed that first dawn had long since been replaced, but the bond they'd forged that morning remained strong, a testament to the power of second chances and the courage to take them.